It was late October of 2017 when I decided to spend a week alone at a cabin in northern Minnesota. I had just turned 33. I worked a demanding job in logistics and felt like I was slowly burning out. I hadn't taken time off in over a year, and my manager practically forced me to use some of my PTO before the year ended. I figured I'd go somewhere quiet, somewhere away from traffic, emails, and constant calls. I didn't want to fly or travel far. I just wanted to drive somewhere quiet, be around nature, and reset. I found a listing on a small vacation rental site. It wasn't on any of the big platforms. The cabin was owned by an older guy named Martin, who lived a couple hours south of the area. It sat on a private stretch of land near a small lake, about 20 minutes outside of a tiny town called Elmswood. The photos showed a basic, square-shaped wood cabin. It had one bedroom, a kitchen, and a sitting area with a wood stove. No internet. Cell signal was weak. The nearest neighbor was about half a mile away, and the place was surrounded by trees on 3 sides, with the lake on the other. It looked exactly like what I needed. I left Minneapolis early on a Sunday morning. The drive took just under 4 hours. As I got farther north, the road narrowed and cell signal dropped. The last 30 minutes of the drive were on a gravel road full of dips and loose rock. My car, a small hatchback, struggled with some of the deeper ruts. When I finally pulled up to the clearing where the cabin sat, I felt that mix of isolation and calm that I had been craving. The lake shimmered under a cloudy sky. The trees were already losing their leaves, and the air smelled like wet pine and cold dirt. The cabin was smaller in person but clean. There was a tiny front porch with a bench. Inside, the wood stove sat in the corner next to a worn-out armchair. The kitchen had a 2-burner stove, a sink with a hand pump, and some shelves with basic supplies. The bedroom had a twin-sized bed with flannel sheets and a heavy quilt. There were no pictures on the walls, no TV, no radio, just bare wood and silence. Felt good. That first day, I unpacked my groceries, set up some firewood, and walked the perimeter of the property. There was an old dock stretching out into the lake. The boards were warped and grayed, but it looked stable enough. I stood at the end for a while, just listening. No traffic, no planes overhead, just birds and water. That night, I made pasta on the little stove and sat in the armchair with a book I had brought. Around 9 p.m., it was fully dark. I threw some logs in the stove, climbed into bed, and slept better than I had in months. The second day, I started noticing how quiet it really was. I don't just mean peaceful, I mean dead quiet. Even during the day, I barely heard any animals. A few birds, sure, but no squirrels, no insects buzzing, no rustling. I figured it was the time of year. Maybe everything was already settling in for winter. On the third night, I woke up around 2 a.m. for no real reason. I wasn't cold or uncomfortable, just awake. I stayed in bed for a minute, trying to figure out what had stirred me. Then I realized it was the silence. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet where your ears start ringing. I got up, walked into the main room, and opened the front door. The porch creaked. The air was freezing. I looked out at the trees. Nothing moved. Even the lake was still. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, then closed the door and went back to bed. The next morning, I hiked a small trail that looped through the woods behind the cabin. It wasn't marked on any map, but Martin had left a note saying there was a trail that looped around the lake and back to the cabin. The path was narrow and overgrown in places. I had to step over fallen branches and duck under limbs. After about 30 minutes, I reached a small clearing with some stumps that looked like they'd been used as seats around a campfire. I sat for a while, then finished the loop. That night, I went to bed early. I was tired from the hike, but around 1:30 a.m., I woke up again. This time I was sweating. The stove had gone out and the cabin was cold. I got up to throw in more wood, but then I noticed something strange. The front door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it. I remembered clearly turning the bolt before bed. I checked the door for any marks. Nothing. I chalked it up to forgetfulness, locked it again, and went back to bed. But I didn't sleep much. The next few days passed slowly. I tried to enjoy the peace, but something felt off. I started getting paranoid. I'd wake up at random hours, convinced I heard footsteps on the porch or something tapping the window. But when I looked, nothing was there. I started leaving the stove burning all night just for the light. One afternoon, I noticed something strange out by the lake. There were fresh footprints in the mud. Not mine. These were bigger and deeper. I hadn't seen anyone. The nearest neighbor was a long walk away, and I hadn't heard any vehicles. I followed the prints for a few feet, but they disappeared once they reached the grass. I stood there for a while, staring at the trees across the water. I felt watched. On the 6th night, it got worse. I was lying in bed when I heard something outside. A crunch, like someone stepping on leaves. Then another. I didn't move. I just stared at the ceiling. It was cold, but my palms were sweating. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard a soft knock on the wall of the cabin. Just once. I stayed in bed, barely breathing. After maybe 10 minutes, I got up and checked every window. I didn't see anyone, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By the 7th morning, I had made up my mind to leave early. I was supposed to check out the next day, but I couldn't take another night. I packed everything fast. When I stepped outside with my bags, I noticed the firewood stack was different. Some of it had been moved. Not a lot, but enough that I knew someone had been there. I didn't even bother checking for more footprints. The drive back to Minneapolis felt longer than it should have. I kept checking my rearview mirror. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me for days. When I got home, I emailed Martin and thanked him for the stay. I didn't mention anything weird. I figured he'd think I was imagining things. A few days later, I checked the listing again out of curiosity. It was gone. The entire page had been taken down. I searched the address, but nothing came up. I still think about that week. I wonder if someone knew I was there alone. Maybe they'd seen other people stay there. Maybe they were just messing with me. But I don't think it was just harmless fun. Whoever it was, they wanted me to know they were close. They didn't break in or steal anything. They didn't hurt me, but they made sure I knew they were there. Since then, I haven't gone on any solo trips. I stick to places with good reviews, close neighbors, and strong cell signal. I still love the idea of being alone in nature, but now I make sure I'm never really alone. I was 32 when I decided to take a week off work and head out to a small cabin in northern Vermont. It was October of 2016, and the leaves were at peak color. I'd been feeling burned out. My job as a warehouse manager in Hartford had worn me down more than usual. I hadn't taken time for myself in nearly a year, and I needed quiet. I didn't want to go anywhere fancy or social. I didn't want tours, guides, or crowds. I just wanted silence and maybe some fresh air. I booked a small off-grid cabin through a listing I found online. It wasn't through a big site like Airbnb. It was a personal ad someone had placed on a quiet forum I followed, offering a week in a one-room cabin for a small fee. They said it had solar power, a propane stove, a wood stove, and a small spring nearby for water. The photos showed a small A-frame deep in a patch of maple and birch trees, backed up by a hill with thick undergrowth. I liked how plain it looked. There were no roads visible in the pictures, just a footpath. It felt remote, which was what I wanted. I left Hartford early on a Sunday morning and drove about 5 hours. I passed small towns and winding roads that got narrower the deeper into the forest I went. By the time I got to the dirt road that led to the cabin, I had no cell signal and hadn't seen another car in over half an hour. I followed the instructions from the owner, who said I'd have to park by a rusted gate and hike the rest of the way in. The hike took maybe 30 minutes. I wore my old hiking boots, carried a backpack with essentials, and brought a cooler with food I planned to eat over the next few days. I also carried a jug of filtered water just in case. The path was covered in leaves and barely looked like a trail in places. It was quiet out there, almost too quiet. No birds, no breeze, no other sounds. Just the occasional creak of a branch or the crunch of my boots. When I saw the cabin, I felt some relief. It looked exactly like the photos. One window, one door, smoke pipe out the roof. It was small, just one room with a cot, a wood stove, a small folding table, and some shelving with basic cooking gear. I unpacked, set up my sleeping bag, and started settling in. That first day was uneventful. I walked around the property, marked some trails with bright tape so I wouldn't get lost, and sat by the spring for a while just listening to the wind pick up. I made pasta that night on the propane stove, lit a few candles, and read until I felt tired. I slept better than I had in months. The next morning, I woke up early to the sound of something crunching outside. I looked out the small window but didn't see anything. Probably a deer or squirrel. Still, I felt a little uneasy. I got dressed, stepped out with a thermos of coffee, and looked around. Nothing. No tracks. I walked out toward the trail I'd come in on, just to check if anyone had passed through. The leaves were still untouched. No prints but mine. I told myself I was just being paranoid and let it go. By the third day, I noticed little things. I'd leave something one way and come back to find it slightly different. A mug turned around. My folded jacket not quite where I remembered leaving it. One time I came back from a walk and my backpack zipper was open. I had zipped it. I always zipped it. I checked inside, nothing missing. Maybe I left it open. Maybe I didn't. I told myself the same thing over and over. That night, I locked the cabin door, even though it was just a wooden latch. I stacked some firewood inside and kept the axe by the cot. Just a precaution. I read a little before bed again, but I kept listening to every noise. I didn't sleep as well. On the fourth day, I found a boot print down by the spring that wasn't mine. Mine had heavy tread. This one didn't. It was smoother, maybe a work boot. It was fresher than the others too. I squatted and studied it. It hadn't rained, and there hadn't been wind to shift the leaves. This was new. I stood up slowly and looked around the trees, scanning the trunks for any signs of movement. Nothing. I stayed out a little longer to see if anyone was nearby, but there were no other signs. No trash, no voices, no trail. That night, I didn't sleep much at all. I kept the fire low so it wouldn't give off too much light. I kept my flashlight beside me. Around 2 a.m., I heard something thump lightly on the cabin wall. Then again. Then silence. I sat up and listened, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. I eventually laid back down but didn't really sleep. The next morning, I found a long scratch on the side of the cabin. It wasn't deep, just a surface scrape, but it was new. Too high for an animal. I checked the trees nearby and saw no signs of someone hiding or living around there. I thought about packing up, but I didn't want to hike out through the woods alone while scared. I figured staying inside during the night was safer than walking out alone in the dark. I decided to make noise during the day. I banged logs together, played music from a little speaker I brought, stomped around loudly, just so anyone out there would know I was aware and wasn't going to be surprised. It made me feel better, even if it probably didn't do anything. On the sixth day, I woke up to the door wide open. I know I locked it. I know I latched it shut from the inside. My gear wasn't touched, nothing stolen, but the door was open. I felt something tighten in my chest. I walked outside with my axe in one hand and looked for tracks. There were a few more boot prints leading off to the right, past the spring, into thicker trees I hadn't explored yet. I didn't follow them. I stayed near the cabin, nervous, waiting for the sun to rise higher. I ate sparingly that day. I packed my bag slowly. I knew I was going to leave the next morning, first light. I even tied a little string across the door so I'd know if someone tried to come in again. I barely slept that night. Every noise sounded louder than it was. At one point, I heard what sounded like distant footsteps crunching leaves. Then nothing again. The night passed slow. The next morning, the string was broken. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack, left the rest of the food, and started hiking out just as the sun started coming up. I moved fast, too fast in some places. I tripped once, scraped my knee, but didn't stop. I didn't feel safe until I saw my car. When I got to it, I found the driver's side door slightly open. It hadn't been like that. I was sure. I looked inside. Everything was still there, but on the passenger seat was a folded piece of paper. I picked it up slowly. There were only 3 words written in rough handwriting. You were watched. I left fast. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main highway. I didn't call the police. I didn't report anything. I didn't go back for my cooler or the rest of my stuff. I never contacted the person who listed the cabin. I couldn't even find the post again later. That trip changed how I see being alone in the woods. I still go out into nature sometimes, but never that far and never alone. I've since added cameras around my house. I lock every door twice. I never sleep as deeply anymore. I learned something that week I didn't expect to learn. That there are people out there who want to make you feel like prey, and the scariest part is when they don't want to hurt you. They just want to remind you that they could. And that's what stayed with me the most. Not the cabin, not the scratches, not the boot prints, just the quiet reminder that someone watched me for days without ever being seen, and they wanted me to know it. I was 29 when I decided to take a break from the city. Life in Lahore had become a blur of deadlines and traffic jams. I needed solitude, a place to clear my head. A friend mentioned a cabin he knew of, nestled deep within the Chitral forests. It was owned by his uncle but had been vacant for years. He assured me it was safe, just isolated. I packed essentials: canned food, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a journal. The drive took nearly 12 hours, winding through narrow mountain roads. By the time I arrived, dusk was settling in. The cabin stood alone, surrounded by towering pines. Its wooden exterior was weathered, but the structure seemed sound. Inside, dust covered most surfaces. Cobwebs adorned the corners, and the air was thick with the scent of aged timber. I lit a fire in the hearth, its warmth slowly pushing back the cold. There was no electricity, but I had brought enough batteries to last a week. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, reading and jotting down thoughts. The silence was profound, interrupted only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves. It was peaceful. On the second day, I explored the surroundings. A narrow trail led deeper into the woods. I followed it for about an hour, noting the dense underbrush and the absence of human footprints. Returning to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The front door was ajar. I was certain I'd closed it. Inside, nothing seemed disturbed. I chalked it up to the wind. That night, I was awakened by a faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, like someone gently knocking on wood. I sat up, heart pounding. The sound seemed to come from the back of the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously approached the rear window. Shining the light outside, I saw nothing but trees swaying in the breeze. The tapping had stopped. The following morning, I found footprints near the back door. They were faint but unmistakable. Barefoot, human. They led from the woods to the cabin and back. A chill ran down my spine. I decided to stay indoors that day, keeping the fire going and the doors locked. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I noticed a small object on the porch. It was a carved wooden figure, resembling a human with exaggerated features. I hadn't seen it earlier. Someone had placed it there. I left it untouched and retreated inside, bolting the door. Sleep was elusive. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, the tapping resumed, louder this time. It moved around the cabin from one wall to another. I sat in the center of the room, clutching a fire poker, flashlight in hand. The sounds continued for hours before finally ceasing just before dawn. The first light, I ventured outside. More footprints, more wooden figures, now 3 in total, each placed at different points around the cabin. I decided it was time to leave. Packing quickly, I loaded my belongings into the car. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the cabin. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, partially obscured by trees. I couldn't make out any features, but it was watching me. I didn't wait to see more. I drove away, not stopping until I reached the main road. Back in Lahore, I tried to rationalize the events. Perhaps local villagers playing tricks, or my imagination running wild in isolation. But the fear felt real. I never returned to that cabin, and my friend never mentioned it again. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear the tapping. It was the kind of early fall morning where the crisp air nips at your skin, but the warmth of the sun still manages to peek through the trees. I had been looking forward to this hiking trip for weeks. The idea of getting away from the noise of daily life in town, leaving behind the constant buzz of my phone, and finding some peace in the woods was exactly what I needed. My name is Noah, and I'm 32 years old. I've been hiking for years, but this was my first solo trip in quite some time. The plan was simple: hike up to the ridge of Bald Mountain, where there's a small outpost. It's known for its amazing views of the valley below, especially as the seasons start to change. The trail was long, but nothing I couldn't handle. I started off early in the morning from the trailhead near the edge of a small town in northern Washington, where the trees already looked like they were starting to change into their fall colors. I'd heard about this trail from a couple of friends, and they all said it was worth the hike. The guidebook said it would take a solid 8 hours to get up to the ridge, but I figured I could do it in less time. I've always had a strong pace when hiking. The first couple of hours went by smoothly. The trail was well marked, and the path wound its way through a dense forest of fir trees. I could hear the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush, but nothing that made me feel uneasy. I was surrounded by nothing but the sounds of nature: the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the occasional call of a bird, and the rustling of the wind in the trees. The morning light filtered through the canopy, casting a beautiful green glow over the moss-covered rocks and fallen logs. There were a few patches of fog hanging low in the valleys below, but that only made the scene more peaceful. I felt a sense of contentment, like everything was in its right place. After a while, the forest began to thin out, and I found myself climbing steadily. The air grew cooler as I ascended, and the smell of pine and wet earth filled my nose. I took a break at one of the marked viewpoints to catch my breath and take in the scenery. Below me, the valley stretched out, the town I'd left behind barely visible now, hidden by the dense tree line. I'd been hiking for almost 4 hours when I noticed something strange. The trail started to change. It wasn't anything dramatic at first. The rocks were a bit looser, the ground a little more uneven, but it wasn't anything that should have made me feel uneasy. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I ignored it at first. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe the elevation was getting to me. But as I continued up the path, the feeling grew. It wasn't the normal sense of isolation I was used to while hiking. This felt different, like the woods were closing in on me, watching me, waiting for something. By the time I reached the halfway point of the trail, I started hearing something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't a sound from the natural world. It wasn't an animal, at least not anything I recognized. It was almost like a distant rustling, faint at first, but then becoming more distinct. It almost sounded like something large moving through the underbrush. I stopped in my tracks and listened carefully, my heart starting to race. The sound came again, this time closer, as if something or someone was walking parallel to me just out of sight. The path ahead was mostly open, a wide stretch with tall ferns and occasional brush, but I couldn't see anyone or anything. I stood still for a while, waiting for the noise to stop or for any sign of what was making it, but nothing appeared. I tried to push the unsettling thought aside. Maybe it was just a deer or a bear moving through the trees, although I hadn't seen any signs of animals on the trail up to this point. I told myself that it was probably nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I kept going, the rustling seemed to follow. Every time I moved, I heard it, now unmistakably close. It was like something or someone was deliberately staying hidden, just out of sight. The quiet, peaceful hike I'd started with was slipping away, replaced by a growing sense of unease. I came to a part of the trail that dipped into a small valley. The trees were thick here, the canopy so dense that it almost felt like night despite it being early afternoon. The air was heavier, and I felt a drop in temperature as I descended. I thought maybe this was just a natural part of the landscape. Sometimes the temperature drops when you're in a shadowed part of the woods. But there was something about the way the trees were so tightly packed together here that made me feel even more trapped. That's when I heard it again, the rustling. This time, it was loud enough to make my heart skip a beat. It wasn't just an animal anymore. It was something else. I froze, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but I pushed the fear down. I wasn't going to let my mind control me. I walked on, faster now, trying to make it to the clearing ahead where the trail would open up again. As I rounded a corner in the path, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A large patch of the trail had been disturbed. The dirt was dug up, rocks displaced, as if something had been digging there. There were no tracks, no clear signs of what had caused the disruption, but it was fresh, and it was the first real sign of anything that felt wrong. I didn't want to linger, so I kept moving, but the rustling continued to follow me, closer now. I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears. My senses were on high alert. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind through the trees seemed to amplify the growing tension in the air. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but it wasn't easy. It felt like something was just waiting for me to make a mistake. I pressed on, finally reaching the clearing where the trees opened up again. For a moment, I felt a sense of relief, but it was short-lived. As I stepped into the clearing, I saw something that made my heart sink. A large boulder lay across the path, but it wasn't just any boulder. It had been moved there. The ground around it was disturbed, and I could see scratch marks on the stone as though it had been dragged. At that moment, everything hit me. Someone or something had been following me, moving the boulder to block my path. The reality of the situation slammed into me with full force. I wasn't alone out here. The hairs on my neck stood up as I quickly scanned my surroundings. I was in the open now, but there were no other hikers in sight. No one to help me if something went wrong. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, and I couldn't shake the sense that I was being hunted. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to calm myself and think logically. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe someone else was hiking this trail and had moved the boulder to clear the path for themselves. But the scratch marks, they didn't sit right. They looked fresh, as if someone had tried to drag it recently. And the rustling, the noises, it all felt too deliberate, too planned. I realized then that I had to leave. The sense of danger was too real to ignore. I turned around and started to head back the way I came. The trail felt different now. What had seemed like a peaceful, quiet walk was now an uphill battle against fear. Every rustle in the brush, every crack of a branch underfoot, made my stomach drop. I kept moving as fast as I could without making noise. My mind raced with possibilities. Who else could be out here? What did they want? I didn't have any answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay on this trail any longer. The way back felt longer than the hike up. Every step felt like I was being pulled backward, away from safety. But I didn't stop. Couldn't. By the time I reached the trailhead again, the sun was beginning to set. I was exhausted, my body aching from the fast pace. But the relief of finally being back at the parking lot was indescribable. I knew I had narrowly escaped something dangerous, something I couldn't fully explain. I never went back to Bald Mountain. That hike left a lasting impression on me. I still wonder who or what had been following me that day. But I'm grateful for one thing. I listened to my instincts and got out in time. I had never been one for the extreme outdoors. Growing up in the city, the idea of hiking through dense forests or trekking up mountains always seemed like something people did for adventure, for fun. But when my friend Emma invited me to join her on a hiking trip through the Hoosier National Forest in Indiana, I felt like I needed a change. I was 28 years old, a bit tired of the usual routine of work and home. It sounded like a good way to push myself out of my comfort zone. What could go wrong? I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, the sun barely up, casting a pale light over the trees. Emma was already there, stretching by the car. She was an avid hiker, someone who could walk miles without breaking a sweat. I, on the other hand, hadn't really hiked since I was a teenager, and even then, it had been just a few simple paths with no real challenge. Emma smiled and waved as I approached. "Ready for this?" she asked, not waiting for an answer before she started moving toward the trail. I followed her, trying to match her pace, feeling the weight of the backpack pressing on my shoulders. We started out easy. The path was wide and well-maintained, the ground covered with pine needles and the occasional rock. The forest was quiet, almost unnervingly so. There was no wind, no animals, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the dirt. I tried not to think about how far we were from civilization. I wasn't used to the feeling of being alone in nature like this, isolated. The deeper we went into the woods, the more the trail seemed to narrow. The trees around us grew thicker, their branches stretching out like fingers, blocking the sunlight and casting the path into shadow. My nerves started to kick in. I had heard stories about hikers getting lost in forests like this, or worse, encountering wild animals. But Emma seemed perfectly at ease, chatting away about her past hiking trips and the different kinds of wildlife she'd seen. I forced myself to focus on her words, trying to push away the unease creeping up my spine. The first sign that something was off came after a few hours of hiking. We had stopped to rest by a stream, the cool water rushing over smooth rocks. I was sipping from my water bottle when I noticed something out of place. A small clearing off to the side of the trail. At first, it seemed like nothing, just another patch of grass and scattered trees. But something about it felt wrong. It wasn't like the usual open spaces we'd passed before. There was a distinct lack of vegetation, the ground barren and cracked. It looked as if something had disturbed the earth. My eyes scanned the area, but I didn't say anything. Emma noticed me staring and followed my gaze. "What's up?" she asked casually, noticing the odd look on my face. "That clearing," I said, pointing toward it. "It doesn't look right." She turned her head, glancing over. "Oh, that's just an old campsite," she said, her voice dismissive. "I've passed by here before. People used to camp there, but it's abandoned now." I nodded, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. Still, I couldn't help but feel that there was something about that spot that didn't sit right with me. I pushed the thought to the back of my mind and followed Emma as she continued down the trail. As the day wore on, the trail became steeper. The trees grew taller, their trunks wider, the underbrush thick and tangled. I found myself slowing down, my legs beginning to ache from the steady incline. Emma, however, moved ahead with ease, her breathing steady and calm. By late afternoon, we reached the top of the hill, where a small, flat area offered a breathtaking view of the surrounding forest. The sun was starting to set, casting a golden light over the landscape. We set up camp here, a small, basic shelter that Emma had brought along. Nothing more than a few sleeping bags and a tent. I tried to relax, but my mind kept drifting back to that clearing. As we sat by the fire, eating our dinner and chatting, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. It was an odd sensation, like the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up for no reason. I kept scanning the trees around us, but saw nothing unusual. Emma didn't seem bothered by it at all, so I pushed the thought aside. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I couldn't sleep. The darkness outside felt oppressive, like the forest was alive and pressing in on us. I could hear the sounds of the wind in the trees, the occasional rustling of leaves, and the distant call of an owl. But there was something else, a subtle, almost imperceptible noise that seemed to come from somewhere just beyond the campfire's light. It was faint at first, like a soft shuffle, maybe the sound of an animal moving through the underbrush. But it didn't stop. The sound persisted, moving closer, then farther away, then closer again. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the fact that it was moving so erratically made me uneasy. I lay there in the darkness, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, listening intently. The noise continued, now accompanied by what sounded like the snapping of twigs. It was getting closer. I reached for my flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to remain calm, reminding myself that it was just a wild animal. But the thought that it might be something more, something I couldn't explain, kept gnawing at me. I didn't want to wake Emma. She seemed so sure of herself, and I didn't want to sound paranoid. But the noise kept coming, now almost directly outside the tent. My pulse quickened, and I could feel my breath becoming shallow. I waited for a few more minutes, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but it wasn't stopping. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing to see. Just the quiet forest, the distant stars, and the trees that seemed to stretch on forever. The noise had stopped too. I stood there for a moment, letting the cool night air wash over me. My thoughts raced. Was it just my imagination? Or had someone been out there? I scanned the area again, but the darkness swallowed up everything beyond the reach of the flashlight. Eventually, I decided it was best to head back to the tent. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But as I turned to go, I saw something that made my heart stop. At the edge of the camp, barely visible in the low light, was a shape. A figure standing still between the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, and I couldn't make out any details. It wasn't large, but it was there. A human shape. I backed up slowly, retreating into the safety of the tent. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew I had to tell Emma. Still, I didn't want to seem irrational, so I kept quiet, hoping it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps my mind playing games with me. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in those woods. My thoughts drifted back to the clearing we had passed earlier in the day. That strange, unsettling feeling lingered. By morning, I was exhausted. Emma, on the other hand, was her usual chipper self, eager to get back on the trail. I forced a smile and packed up my gear, trying to act normal, but something inside me told me we needed to leave. As we descended the hill and continued our hike, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was like something was following us, staying just out of sight. Every time I turned a corner or looked over my shoulder, I expected to see something or someone waiting there, but there was nothing. Just the same trees, the same winding path. We eventually made it back to the trailhead, my mind still racing. I didn't tell Emma about the figure I'd seen, figuring it was best not to dwell on it. But as I reached my car and started the engine, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had barely escaped something. What exactly, I wasn't sure, but I knew one thing. I would never look at the forest the same way again. And when I got home, I Googled that area of the Hoosier National Forest. What I found made my blood run cold. There had been reports of people disappearing in those woods over the years. Not many, but enough to make me realize that the feeling I'd had out there wasn't just my imagination. I haven't gone back to that forest since. I had been planning this hike for months. The idea of walking through the untouched wilds of the Appalachian Mountains had always intrigued me. It was just me, alone, without anyone else to distract me or rely on. I was ready for some time away from the noise of the world. I woke up early, the crisp morning air filling my lungs as I took my first breath of the day. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the sky was still a mix of dark blue and the faintest pink and orange. It was a beautiful scene, and I felt a rush of excitement. I had packed my gear the night before. Nothing too fancy, but the essentials. A tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, water, a map, and a compass. My boots were worn in, and my backpack sat comfortably on my shoulders. I drove out to the trailhead, a secluded part of the mountains I'd been wanting to explore for a while. The roads were still quiet, the only noise the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. The last thing I wanted was a crowd of hikers, so I was thankful that this trail wasn't as popular as some others. The solitude was exactly what I was looking for. By the time I reached the start of the trail, the sky had lightened considerably, and I could hear the soft chirping of birds in the trees. I strapped on my pack, adjusted the straps, and checked my boots again. They felt solid. I took one last look at the car before heading into the woods. The trail wasn't particularly difficult, but it was steep in certain areas. There was a steady incline as I walked, but I was in no rush. The beauty of the landscape was enough to make me forget about any soreness in my legs. Tall trees surrounded me, their trunks thick and rough with age. The forest smelled earthy, with hints of pine and damp soil. Every so often, a small breeze would sweep through, rustling the leaves and creating a soft whispering sound. I passed a small stream within the first hour of the hike, the water trickling over rocks in a peaceful, almost musical way. The air was growing warmer as the sun continued to rise higher in the sky. I was sweating lightly now, but nothing unbearable. I stopped to take a drink of water and surveyed the trail ahead. There was no one else around, just the quiet sounds of nature. About 2 hours into the hike, I came to a section of the trail that looked less traveled. The path narrowed and the trees grew denser. The sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift with every step I took. It was here that I first noticed something odd. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but there was a strange, unsettling silence in this part of the woods. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of a breeze rustling through the trees. It was just still. I had been on enough trails to know that this wasn't normal. A sense of unease crept up on me, but I pushed it aside, thinking it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I kept walking, trying to ignore the odd sensation in my gut. The trail became more difficult to follow, with overgrown plants and fallen branches making it hard to stay on course. The map I had seemed to indicate that I was still on the right path, but something about it felt off. I slowed my pace, scanning the area more closely. It was then that I saw it. A small pile of rocks, carefully stacked, stood just off the trail. It wasn't a cairn meant to mark a trail. This was different. The rocks were arranged too deliberately, too precisely. It was almost like a warning. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I took a deep breath and decided to keep moving. I walked for another half hour, but that strange silence didn't lift. In fact, it only deepened. The woods felt more oppressive, the shadows darker. My instincts were telling me to turn around, but I didn't. I wasn't ready to give up on the hike just yet. I had come this far and I had the time to keep going. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed something ahead. A small clearing appeared, bathed in dappled sunlight. It looked peaceful, almost welcoming, and I decided to rest there. I set down my pack, stretched out on the soft grass, and closed my eyes for a moment. When I opened them again, it was as if something had shifted. The clearing felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was as though the entire forest had become aware. I sat up quickly, my heart racing. The sound of birds had returned, but now it was almost too loud, too constant. The wind picked up, swirling around me in a way that made my skin crawl. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone, anyone, standing at the edge of the clearing. But there was nothing. I gathered my things and decided to keep going. The trail ahead seemed to grow steeper, the forest thicker, as if I were venturing deeper into some unknown part of the mountains. My gut was telling me to stop, to turn back, but my mind overruled it. I had to keep going. I had to finish this. The trail twisted and turned, climbing steadily upward. The trees grew taller and more twisted, the air thinner, and the silence returned. It was now completely still, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I was exhausted both physically and mentally. My legs ached from the climb, and the weight of my pack seemed heavier with each step. I finally reached the summit after what felt like hours. The view was incredible, but the sense of relief I expected didn't come. Instead, a strange feeling settled in my chest. The mountaintop was quiet, and there was something unsettling about the way the rocks seemed to form a natural circle, almost like a ritual site. I felt the urge to leave but stayed a moment longer, unsure why. Then I heard it, a noise, a rustle in the underbrush, a sound that didn't belong in the stillness. I turned toward the noise, my body frozen in place. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. The air grew colder. Every sense I had was on alert, and the hairs on my neck stood at attention. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, but nothing came into view. No animals, no people, just the forest silently watching me. My heart was thudding in my chest as I took a few cautious steps back, but then I heard it again, closer this time. A soft scraping sound, followed by a low, almost imperceptible growl. My body went into full panic mode. I didn't think, didn't question it. I turned and ran, as fast as I could, down the trail. The path was harder to navigate now, the rocks more jagged, the trees growing closer together, blocking my way. My breath came in sharp gasps as I sprinted, not knowing if something was behind me or if it was just my mind playing tricks. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. I ran for what seemed like hours, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Finally, I saw a break in the trees ahead, a clearing. I didn't stop to think, just bolted through the underbrush and stumbled into the open area, gasping for breath. The forest behind me felt like it was closing in, but the clearing was wide, open, and it seemed safe. I collapsed onto the ground, my chest heaving as I tried to calm my racing heart. It was only then, sitting there, in the eerie quiet, that I realized what had happened. I wasn't sure if it was a bear, a person, or something else, but I knew I had been followed. Whatever it was, it hadn't made itself known until I had reached that summit, that circle of stones. And that feeling of being watched, of being trapped, had never left me. I was a long way from civilization, and my instincts had been right. I should have turned back. The silence had been an omen. But somehow, in that moment of terror, I realized I had made it out. And that, in itself, was a victory. I took a long, deep breath, stood up, and made my way back down the trail, this time with purpose. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the mountains. I had my bearings now and knew I would make it back to the trailhead before dark. The sound of my boots on the dirt trail was the only noise I could hear, and it was comforting. I kept my head down, focused on the path, until the familiar sight of the trailhead came into view. When I reached my car, I didn't even hesitate. I threw my pack into the trunk and got in, driving away without looking back. The mountains were beautiful, but there were some things out there that weren't meant to be discovered. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Even now, all these years later, I'm not sure I'll ever fully understand what happened out there. But I know one thing for sure, I will never hike that trail again. I was 28 years old when I decided to go on this hike. The idea had been floating around in my mind for months, and I'd finally decided to do it. My goal was to push my limits, to step out of my comfort zone, to test my endurance. I chose a trail deep in the forests of the Cascade Mountains, one that was known for its isolation. It wasn't overly popular, and that appealed to me. I wanted solitude. It was early autumn, the kind of time when the weather still held on to summer's warmth, but you could already sense the chill of the coming winter. I remember packing my backpack the night before: water, some snacks, my camera, a first aid kit, a map of the area, and my trusty hiking boots. It didn't seem like much, but I figured I could handle the hike easily. After all, I'd done other trails before, though none quite like this one. The sun was just beginning to rise when I set out. The trail was marked as moderate, but I knew it could be tougher the further I went. It was a clear morning with a light breeze that carried the smell of pine trees. The sound of my boots crunching on the dirt trail was calming. For the first couple of miles, I felt at peace. The woods were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, and I relished the quiet. It was just me, nature, and the sense of freedom that came with being so far from civilization. I wasn't really expecting any trouble. The trail wasn't particularly difficult, and the first few miles were a breeze. I passed by the occasional rock formation, a small stream, and even some wildflowers still blooming in the shaded parts of the forest. The higher I climbed, the quieter it got. My mind started to wander, thinking about things back home, but the sound of a distant rustle caught my attention. At first, I thought it was just a deer, but something felt off about it. The movement was too quick, too jerky. I stopped in my tracks, listening closely. There was no other noise, no birds calling, nothing to break the silence. I shook it off, figuring it was just my nerves acting up. After a moment, I kept going, but the sense that something was wrong lingered in the back of my mind. I pushed forward, climbing higher up the trail. The forest around me started to feel denser, darker even. The trees here were thick and twisted, with low-hanging branches that blocked the light. It felt as though the shadows were growing deeper the further I went, and the air felt colder. By now, I was about halfway up the mountain, and I decided to take a short break. I pulled out my water and sat on a rock near the edge of the trail. Looking down below, the forest stretched out for miles. It was incredibly beautiful, but there was something unsettling about being so alone. That unsettling feeling grew stronger as I scanned the area. The wind had picked up, and the trees swayed with it. It was almost as if the forest was alive, watching me. As I sat there, a feeling of being observed crept up my spine. I turned around quickly, half expecting to see someone behind me, but no one was there. There was nothing, just trees, just the trail. I took a deep breath and stood up, shaking off the feeling. Get a grip, I told myself. The rest of the hike was uneventful until I reached a small clearing. It was a perfect spot to stop and eat lunch, so I pulled out a sandwich and sat down on a fallen log. That's when I noticed the tracks. They were fresh and they looked recent. A set of large, wide prints. Too big to be a deer, too round to be a bear. They were human-shaped, but I didn't want to assume anything. I wasn't alone here, clearly. Could have been some other hiker, though I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail for hours. I didn't want to think about it too much. After all, hikers leave trails, right? But as I chewed my sandwich, a prickling sensation crept over me. I stood up abruptly, wiped my hands on my pants, and kept walking. The trail began to narrow again, and the landscape became steeper. I was nearing the summit, and the trees thinned out, replaced by jagged rocks and scattered patches of grass. The air had grown thinner, and my breathing quickened as I pushed myself up the final stretch. The sun had started to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the mountain as I reached the peak. At the summit, the view was breathtaking. I could see the entire valley below me, the stretch of trees, the winding river, and even the distant peaks of other mountains. It was exactly what I needed, this moment of solitude, the beauty of nature. I stood there for several minutes, letting the wind whip around me, but something about the place felt wrong. I can't really explain it. Something in the air felt dense. It wasn't just the usual quiet. It was oppressive, and the sun was setting faster than I realized. I had planned to head back by dusk, but with the light slipping away, I knew I needed to start descending quickly if I didn't want to be caught in the dark. I started back down the trail, but that's when I heard it again, the rustling. But this time it was louder, closer. It sounded like something, or someone, moving through the underbrush. My heart began to race. I didn't want to turn around and look, but I felt as if I couldn't keep walking without knowing what was behind me. So I did. I stopped, turned slowly, and scanned the trees. There, just beyond the reach of the fading sunlight, I saw a figure, a person standing still among the trees. They weren't moving. They weren't coming toward me, but they weren't leaving either. I couldn't make out their face, but I knew they were watching me. Panic flooded through me. Was it another hiker? Maybe, but why hadn't they called out to me? Why weren't they moving? I turned around quickly and started walking again, faster this time. My breath came in short gasps as I pushed myself down the mountain. But no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, quick and steady, as if someone was matching my pace. I didn't stop again. My mind raced, each step growing more frantic as I heard the footsteps grow louder and closer. They were real. They were following me. They weren't just in my head. I had to get out of there. As I neared a sharp bend in the trail, I heard the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, crashing through the brush beside me. I spun around, adrenaline pumping, and for the first time, I saw the figure clearly. A man, tall and unkempt, with wild eyes and a thin, disheveled appearance. He was close, too close. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my ears. His expression was blank, emotionless, and for a split second, everything seemed to slow down. Then, without thinking, I bolted. My legs carried me down the trail, faster than I thought possible. Behind me, I heard the pounding of footsteps, growing closer. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I reached a fork in the trail, where I remembered there was a ranger station nearby. I pushed myself toward it, ignoring the burning in my legs, ignoring the pain. Just get to safety. I reached the ranger station just as darkness fully enveloped the forest. Out of breath, I stumbled inside. The ranger, an older man with a thick beard, looked up at me, alarmed by my state. Without hesitation, I told him everything. The figure, the footsteps, the feeling of being hunted. He listened in silence, then gave me a nod. "There's been reports of someone living off the trail," he said. "We've been looking for him for a while. Stay here until we get the search going. It's not safe out there after dark." I stayed in the ranger station that night, my heart still racing. The figure, the footsteps, they were real. But I wasn't sure if I would have made it out if I hadn't reached the station when I did. I didn't go back to that trail. In fact, I didn't go back to any remote hikes for months after that. The whole experience changed me. I learned that nature can be beautiful, but it can also be cruel, and the idea of solitude can quickly turn into something far more terrifying than you could ever expect. The worst part was that I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, waiting. Maybe he always had been. The wind was cold, biting at my skin, but I didn't care. I'd been looking forward to this hike for months. It had been a stressful year, and I just needed to be alone in nature, away from the noise and distractions of the city. I had chosen the trail carefully, one that was known for its remoteness, far from the usual tourist spots. I needed the solitude, and this was the perfect place for that. The morning was crisp, and the sun had just begun to climb over the horizon as I made my way up the narrow path. It was a Saturday in early October, and I had the whole weekend to myself. The air smelled fresh, earthy, like the forest was still waking up. My boots crunched against the leaves as I walked, and I could hear the occasional rustle in the trees. Squirrels, birds, maybe a deer or two. I kept my eyes peeled for wildlife, but I didn't expect to see much this early in the day. I had planned to cover about 12 miles, which would take me to a scenic overlook that gave a stunning view of the valley below. I was about halfway through when I came to a fork in the trail. One path led uphill, the other seemed to follow a stream down into a ravine. I thought about the uphill route, but something about the stream path caught my attention. It was quiet, peaceful, and I felt like exploring it. I turned left and followed the path downward, my pack swaying with every step. The trees seemed to close in as the trail descended, and the air grew cooler. The scent of pine mixed with damp earth, and the sound of the stream was constant. A soothing gurgle that almost made me forget I was alone out here. Almost. The trail got narrower, more overgrown as I moved deeper into the woods. The trees were tall, their trunks thick and old, their branches entwined in a canopy that let little sunlight through. The ground was uneven, and I had to watch my footing carefully. After a while, I lost sight of the trail markers, the usual signs of a well-maintained path. Small painted blazes on the trees had disappeared. I paused for a moment to check my map, but it didn't show this part of the trail. My phone had no signal, which wasn't unusual for the area, so I shoved it back into my pocket and pressed on. The further I went, the less certain I was about the trail's direction. The stream had turned into more of a creek, trickling through rocks and over fallen logs. There was something about the stillness of the place that felt off. I couldn't explain it. It was beautiful, yes, but there was an eerie quality to it, as though something was just beyond my sight, waiting. I shook off the feeling and tried to focus on the hike. I wasn't going to let my nerves get the better of me. It had been about 2 hours since I started this detour, and the sunlight had started to fade, though the day was still young. I was nearing a clearing when I heard something behind me. It wasn't loud, just a soft rustle of leaves, but it was enough to make me stop dead in my tracks. I turned around quickly, heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there, just the quiet hum of the forest. "Stop being paranoid," I muttered to myself, but even as I said it, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I scanned the area, trying to shake the uncomfortable feeling creeping over me. I kept walking, though the sound of my boots seemed louder now, as if the forest had grown too quiet. I wanted to turn back, but there was something compelling about the clearing ahead. Maybe it was the faint glow of light filtering through the trees, or maybe I just wanted to see it for myself. When I stepped into the clearing, my breath caught. It wasn't much, a small open space in the woods, But there, in the middle, was something that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was a log, or maybe a pile of rocks. But as I got closer, I realized it was a structure. A small shack, half buried in the undergrowth, with a roof that had collapsed in several places. The sight of it took me by surprise. I had heard stories about abandoned cabins in these woods, but they were always somewhere else, somewhere far off. This shack was hidden, like it had been left here intentionally. I could feel my heart race again, but this time, curiosity pushed me forward. I approached the shack cautiously, my boots crunching against the dry ground. There was no sign of life, no fresh footprints, no evidence of recent activity. The door was ajar, hanging by a rusted hinge. It was strange. Who would leave something like this out here? Why hadn't anyone found it before? I peered inside through the gap in the door, but it was too dark to make out much. Still, something about the place seemed wrong. A sense of dread settled over me, and I stepped back, looking around the clearing again. That's when I saw it. Across the clearing, just beyond the trees, there was movement. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it moved again, too deliberate, too calculated. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, my eyes fixed on the spot where I had seen the movement. I waited, my body tense, but nothing else happened. No sound, no more movement. Probably just an animal, I whispered, trying to calm myself, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The shadows seemed to stretch longer in the fading light, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I took a few steps backward, but before I could turn around, I heard it again, a distinct crack of a twig snapping underfoot. I whirled around, scanning the trees, but I saw nothing. I don't know why I didn't leave immediately. Maybe I was too deep into this to turn back. Maybe I didn't want to admit that something was off. But I felt the panic creeping in, tightening my chest. I moved away from the shack and back onto the trail, trying to shake the unease. The sound of the creek still gurgled in the distance, but now the forest felt oppressive, like the trees were leaning in, watching my every move. I kept walking faster now until I reached the point where the trail should have been. But it wasn't there. The path had disappeared, replaced by thick brush and undergrowth. I turned in circles, trying to find the familiar markers, but the more I searched, the more lost I felt. My heart raced as I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction I looked seemed unfamiliar. Panic began to set in as the realization hit. I was lost. The daylight was slipping away, and the air was growing colder. I couldn't stay out here after dark. I needed to get back to the main trail, but I had no idea where that was anymore. I kept walking, hoping that I would stumble across something familiar, but the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the sound of my breath. I had no choice but to keep going. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes, I couldn't tell. It felt like time had stopped. My legs were aching, and my water bottle was nearly empty. My stomach growled, but I didn't stop. Then, just as I was about to lose hope, I saw it. A faint glow in the distance. It wasn't much, just a flicker of light, but it was enough to pull me forward. I stumbled toward it, not caring about the branches scraping against my arms or the uneven ground beneath my feet. I broke through the trees and found myself at the edge of a road. A car passed by and I waved frantically. The driver didn't stop, but I kept waving, feeling the adrenaline surge through me. It wasn't long before another car appeared, and this time it stopped. A woman rolled down her window, concern written on her face. I could barely form words, but I managed to explain where I was. She offered me a ride, and I gratefully accepted, getting in without hesitation. As we drove back toward the nearest town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something. I didn't know what it was. Maybe it was the isolation, the strange shack, or the feeling of being watched. But something had been out there in those woods, something I wasn't supposed to find. When I finally made it back to my car, I didn't hesitate to drive straight home. The whole hike felt like a blur, like I had barely survived an ordeal that I still didn't fully understand. I never went back to those woods. The memory of the shack, the strange movement in the trees, and the sense of being hunted stayed with me long after I left. Some parts of the forest were meant to be left alone, and I knew that now. Some places are better left unexplored, and I didn't need to know why. I wasn't an experienced hiker. I knew the basics, how to read a map, what gear to take, the importance of staying hydrated. But hiking in the mountains, deep into the backcountry, was something I'd never done alone. But it wasn't meant to be a challenging trek. It was a short, easy route to a secluded spot I had heard about. Peaceful, quiet, perfect for clearing my head. I had just turned 30 a few months ago, and life had been hectic. I needed this. A few days off from everything. The phone calls, emails, deadlines, and the constant buzz of city life. A weekend away from the grind was just what I needed. The trailhead was located in the outskirts of the Cascade Range in Washington state. It was a relatively untouched part of the forest, not as busy as some of the other more popular spots. That's part of the reason I chose it, quiet, out of the way. A small parking area sat near the trail, and the trail itself was marked with clear, faded signs showing the path through the woods. There were a couple of other cars parked when I arrived, but none of the hikers seemed interested in the same destination. Most were taking shorter routes, looping back on trails that were closer to the parking lot. I checked my gear one last time before setting off. I packed a small backpack with essentials: a water bottle, a couple of energy bars, a first aid kit, and my camera. I wasn't planning on hiking long, just to the spot where the trail split into a small valley and creek, an area known for its peace and isolation. I started my hike in the early afternoon, the sun still strong and high, the forest a mix of old-growth trees and younger pines. The forest felt calm. There was the occasional rustling of leaves, the sound of distant birds, but nothing too startling. As I walked, the trail wound through the trees, the ground a mix of soft dirt and roots that twisted underfoot. It wasn't steep at first, and the cool shade of the trees made the hike comfortable. The smell of fresh pine and the damp earth was thick in the air, and I could hear the occasional snap of twigs as animals moved nearby. The first mile passed quickly. My breathing wasn't labored, my legs felt good, and the sound of the stream was growing closer. I could already hear the soft babbling of water ahead, signaling I was nearing the spot I had been aiming for. It wasn't far, just a couple of miles, and the trail seemed to get a little less traveled as I went on. The feeling of being alone in the woods started to set in. The silence was different from the peace I had imagined. There were no people around, just the distant hum of insects, the low whistle of wind through the branches. I felt like I was walking through a place forgotten by time. The trees, thick and knotted, were untouched. It felt remote, and for the first time, I wondered if I should have told someone exactly where I was going, just in case. I shook off the thought. This was what I wanted: solitude, a break from the constant barrage of messages and phone calls. I wanted to hear the sound of my own footsteps on the dirt. Another mile passed. The trail was less distinct now, and I had to step over fallen logs and duck under low branches. I was starting to wonder if I had missed the split in the trail when the trees opened up slightly, revealing the creek. It wasn't wide, maybe 5 feet across, but it was fast-moving, with rocks scattered across the water's surface. The water seemed clear, rushing over the rocks and bubbling in the quiet space between the trees. It was perfect, the kind of place I had pictured in my mind when I thought of getting away from everything. I paused for a moment at the creek's edge, deciding where to set up. There was a flat rock near the bank that looked like a good place to sit and rest. I took off my pack and pulled out a water bottle. The sound of the creek was calming, and I let out a slow breath, enjoying the tranquility. But then, I noticed something strange. There was a faint noise, a crack of a branch. Distant, but it wasn't a natural sound. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I turned slowly, scanning the woods. Nothing, just the trees, the creek, and the occasional flurry of leaves. I dismissed it. Probably a deer, maybe a bear. They were around here after all. But as the minutes stretched on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air had shifted slightly. The wind was moving in odd, quick gusts, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I grabbed my camera to take my mind off it. The stillness of the scene, Rocks, trees, and rushing water was the perfect shot. As I clicked the shutter, I scanned the edges of the forest, wondering if someone else had decided to hike to this remote spot. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It lingered. I packed up quickly and decided to get moving. There was a trail farther up the creek I wanted to check out, and I figured it would be best to keep walking. The next part of the hike was slightly steeper, but the trail still wasn't difficult. The trees thinned out in places, offering small breaks in the forest where I could see the mountains rising above me. The trail was winding around rocks, and the air was growing cooler as the sun started to dip behind the ridge. I was just about to take another swig from my water bottle when I heard it again. A snap of a branch, this time much closer. I froze. My heart rate quickened. The sound was coming from the trees just off the trail to my left. I couldn't see anything through the thick underbrush, but I knew that whatever had made the noise was still there, moving. I took a few slow steps forward, listening. My instincts were telling me to move quickly, but something was holding me in place. The woods, which had felt so calming at first, now seemed intimidating. I tried to shake off the rising tension. It was probably an animal, maybe a deer or something else. But then I heard it again, closer this time. This time, it wasn't a snap of a branch. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone was out there. Someone was walking, deliberately, just beyond the trees, moving at the same pace I was. Panic flooded my chest. My first instinct was to turn around and head back down the trail, but I froze. The creek was behind me. The trail ahead felt like it could lead into more isolation, and there was no sign of any other hikers. The nearest road was miles away. I was alone. I didn't want to be paranoid, but I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I picked up my pace, walking faster now, my eyes scanning the trees. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if someone or something was following. The trail twisted around a bend, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye. I jerked my head to the side, but it was gone. Nothing there. I kept walking, faster now, my footsteps louder on the path. I could feel my breathing getting quicker. There were no more sounds of animals, no more rustling of leaves, just the distant, unnerving quiet of the forest. I kept my eyes fixed on the trail ahead, my mind racing. What should I do? Should I turn back and try to make it to the car? Or should I keep going? It was only when I reached the next fork in the trail that I felt a sense of relief. There was no one there. No one had been following me after all. The feeling of being watched slowly faded. The forest didn't feel as heavy anymore. The path was clear, and the quiet was normal again. I chose to keep going up the trail, but my pace was slower now. The unease had settled into my bones, and I couldn't shake the sense that something, or someone, had been nearby. The sound of footsteps still echoed in my mind, even though I hadn't seen anyone. As I reached the summit, I looked out over the valley below. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. There was something calming about seeing the world from a higher vantage point. But the feeling that had gripped me earlier remained. It wasn't until I got back to the trailhead, my car in sight, that I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I was safe. Maybe it had all been my imagination, just the quiet playing tricks on me. But the feeling never fully left. Something was off that day, and it wasn't just the woods. It was the sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. As I drove away, I looked back at the trailhead through my rearview mirror. The parking lot was empty now, just the trees standing tall in the distance. But I couldn't shake the thought that, for whatever reason, I was being watched. And I couldn't explain why that thought haunted me even after I was miles away. It was mid-September of 2017 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip through the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana. I was 33 at the time, living in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, working a flexible job as a freelance graphic designer. I had been feeling burned out and overwhelmed, and I needed a break from the screen and the daily routine. I'd always loved the outdoors, and hiking helped me clear my mind in ways nothing else could. This particular trip wasn't something I had planned for months. It was more of a spur-of-the-moment decision. I looked up trails late one night and settled on a loop trail that wasn't too far, about a 5-hour drive. It looked remote enough to feel like a real escape, but not too dangerous. The trail looped around a set of small alpine lakes and climbed through dense forests, past old mining cabins, and over a high ridge. According to the trail map and forums I read, it would take 2, maybe 3 days max if I took my time. I packed light but careful tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, extra layers, a water filter, first aid kit, bear spray, headlamp, a couple knives, and my old Garmin GPS unit. I left early in the morning, reaching the trailhead by late afternoon. The air was crisp, and the lot was empty except for one other vehicle, a dusty red Tacoma. I locked up my car and started on the trail, planning to make it about 5 or 6 miles in before stopping for the night. The first day was beautiful. The trail was quiet, and I made good time. I passed an old log cabin with a collapsed roof around mile 4. It was covered in moss and tilted hard to one side. I stopped to rest, had some trail mix, and moved on. By dusk, I'd reached a small clearing near a creek and set up camp. I boiled some water for my freeze-dried dinner, ate, and turned in early. That night, it got cold fast. I woke up around 2 a.m. needing to pee. I got out, headlamp on, and wandered about 30 feet from the tent. The woods were dead quiet, so quiet it was unsettling. No wind, no owls, nothing. Just the sound of my boots in the dirt and my own breath. I got that prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I hurried back to the tent, zipped up, and didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I shook it off, probably just nerves from being alone. I made some instant coffee, packed up, and started hiking again. The second day was tougher. Steeper terrain, more switchbacks, and the trail wasn't as well maintained. Around midday, I came to a split. One path was clearly the main trail, marked by a newer wooden sign pointing to the ridge. The other was overgrown, with an older sign half-rotted and unreadable. According to my map, both eventually looped back together, but the older trail cut closer to some abandoned mining areas. I was tempted to go the scenic route, but decided to stick to the newer path. As I climbed higher, the wind picked up. Clouds rolled in by early evening, and I knew I'd have to stop soon. I found a small flat area just off the trail and set up camp. I was above tree line now, and the wind cut through my jacket. I ate quickly and crawled into the tent, wrapping myself tight in the sleeping bag. I dozed off around 9 p.m., but woke up a couple hours later to the sound of something brushing against the tent. At first, I thought it was wind or maybe a branch, but then I remembered there weren't any trees up here. I stayed still, heart pounding, listening. It sounded like something circling the tent, stepping lightly on the gravel. Not heavy like a bear, but careful. I grabbed my headlamp and knife, unzipped the tent slowly, and shone the light outside. Nothing. I stepped out and looked around. The light caught something, a faint shape just beyond the ridge. I couldn't tell if it was a person or just a weird formation in the rock. I stood frozen for a while, then backed into the tent and stayed awake until sunrise. When morning came, everything looked normal. I ate quickly and broke camp. I wanted to get back below tree line and away from that exposed area. My legs were sore, and I had blisters forming on both heels. The trail wound back down into the forest, and I started to feel more at ease again. I passed a rusted-out truck cab buried in brush, and another broken cabin, this one with a collapsed floor and old tools scattered around. I took a few pictures and moved on. Around mid-afternoon, I realized I hadn't seen another person since I started. No hikers, no prints, no voices. That wasn't too unusual for backcountry trails, but it made me feel isolated. I started to feel a little uneasy again. The trail dropped into a narrow gulch, and I followed it, noticing more and more signs of erosion. A lot of the trail had washed out, and I had to scramble over loose rock. Then I slipped. My boot caught on a root, and I fell hard, sliding a few feet down a slope. I landed on my side, and my head smacked a rock. I lay there for a minute, stunned. My ears rang, and I felt nauseous. When I sat up, I saw blood on my sleeve, just a scrape, but enough to scare me. My right wrist hurt bad, and I was dizzy. I dug out my water bottle and took a sip, trying to calm down. I realized I couldn't keep going like that. I needed to stop and regroup. I found a flat area off the trail and set up the tent again. I wrapped my wrist, took some ibuprofen, and lay down. I kept replaying the fall in my head, realizing how fast things could go bad out there. If I'd hit my head harder or broken something, nobody would know where I was. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every little sound put me on edge. I kept thinking about that shape I'd seen the night before, the weird circling noises, the way the trail had seemed to almost lead me into that dangerous area. I felt like I was being led somewhere, and that idea unsettled me more than anything else. In the morning, I checked my map. There was a shortcut back to the trailhead if I followed an old logging road that branched off a couple miles back. It wasn't marked well, but it would shave a half day off the trip. I decided to go for it. My wrist was still aching, and I just wanted out. I backtracked slowly, trying not to slip again. I found the old road, barely visible under fallen trees and brush. I followed it, hoping it was still passable. It started off okay, but a mile in, it turned into a mess. Fallen logs, mud, overgrown plants. I pushed through, getting scratched and dirty, until I found myself in a wide open area that had clearly been logged decades ago. The stumps were gray and weathered, and a few rusted machines sat abandoned. It felt wrong somehow, too quiet again. No birds, no insects, just the wind in the grass. I pushed on. The road picked up again and wound through dense brush. Then I heard it, something behind me. I turned fast, but again saw nothing. But the feeling of being watched returned stronger than ever. I started moving faster, ignoring the pain in my feet and wrist. Just as the sun was getting low, I finally saw the parking lot through the trees. My car was still there, undisturbed. I practically ran the last 100 yards. When I got inside and locked the doors, I sat there shaking. I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to be standing there. But there was nothing, just me, the empty lot, and the last rays of sun. I drove straight back to town, stopping only for gas. I didn't even look at my phone until I got home. The next day, I could barely walk from the pain in my legs. My wrist was swollen, but not broken. I spent the next few days thinking about everything that had happened. None of it was supernatural or impossible. It was all explainable. But that didn't make it feel any less disturbing. I've done a few hikes since then, but nothing that remote. I still love the outdoors, but I stay closer to more popular areas now. I never figured out what that shape was, or what made those sounds outside the tent. Maybe it was just animals. Maybe it was another hiker messing around, though I doubt it. But I do know one thing for sure. Being alone out there, with no help and no one around, changes how you see the world. It reminded me how thin the line is between control and chaos, safety and danger. That trip taught me to take solo hiking more seriously. I upgraded my gear, always leave a route plan with someone, and stick to trails that are better maintained. I learned a lot about myself too, how fear can build from little things, how quickly confidence can turn into panic, and how being prepared isn't just about gear, it's about mindset. I didn't come back from that trip with any dramatic story. Nothing chased me, nothing tried to hurt me, but I came back changed, and sometimes that's enough to make a story worth telling. I've always found peace in the mountains, the kind of peace that comes from the solitude of nature, from being completely alone, surrounded by the quiet of trees and the wind. So when I decided to take a solo hiking trip to Pine Ridge National Park, a remote area in northern Wyoming, I wasn't nervous. I was excited. I had been planning the trip for months, and this was my first real solo hike, one I'd been looking forward to for years. I packed my gear carefully, a sturdy backpack with food, water, a first aid kit, a small tent, a sleeping bag, and a lightweight stove. My boots were well worn from smaller hikes, and I had all the proper gear for a multi-day trek. The weather report was clear, and everything seemed to be set up for a perfect trip. I arrived at the park early in the morning, the air crisp and fresh with the scent of pine trees. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows across the trailhead. There was a sense of anticipation, the kind you feel when you're about to embark on something you've planned for a long time. The first few miles were easy, the path well-trodden, winding through dense woods. The trees stretched high above, blocking out most of the sunlight and casting the forest floor in cool, dark shades. Birds chirped in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves was the only other sound. It was peaceful. It was quiet. I stopped for a short break at a small creek, refilling my water bottle and enjoying the view. The water was clear, flowing swiftly over rocks and moss. I took a moment to admire the scenery, the tall pines, the occasional flash of a red-tailed hawk soaring overhead. But there was something about the stillness that felt unsettling. It wasn't fear, exactly, but an awareness that I was alone, far from civilization, in a place that could be both beautiful and dangerous. After about 4 hours of hiking, I reached my planned campsite, a small clearing near the edge of a steep ridge. The view from here was incredible, the valley below stretching out in all directions, dotted with patches of green and rocky outcrops. I set up camp, making sure everything was secure and ready for the night. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, and the temperature was beginning to drop. I cooked a simple meal over my small stove, the warm food a comfort after a long day's hike. As the light faded, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The sky above me was a deep blue, the stars beginning to emerge in the clear night sky. It was perfect, peaceful, but there was still that nagging feeling in the back of my mind, the one that told me I wasn't as alone as I thought. The wind picked up around midnight, howling through the trees. I was used to the wind at high altitudes, but tonight it felt different. Stronger, louder. It made the trees creak, their branches swaying in the gusts, and every now and then, a twig would snap in the distance. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the wind, but still I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to sleep, curling into my sleeping bag, but the wind kept me awake. The noise was constant, the trees groaning and swaying in the storm. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the wind. But then I heard something else. At first, it was a low rustling sound, barely perceptible over the wind. Then it came again, louder this time, closer. It was unmistakable footsteps. Not the kind of footsteps you'd expect from an animal, but something heavier, more deliberate. My heart started racing. I lay perfectly still, listening. The footsteps came closer, slow and steady, crunching against the fallen leaves and underbrush. Couldn't breathe. I held my breath, straining my ears, but there was nothing, just the wind. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the wind shifting through the trees in odd ways. But then a twig snapped, sharp and clear. I bolted upright, panic flooding my chest. I grabbed for my flashlight, my hand shaking as I clicked it on, pointing it toward the edge of the clearing. There was nothing there, just shadows and trees. My breath came in short gasps as I forced myself to calm down. It's fine, I told myself. It's just an animal or maybe a hiker from another campsite. The thoughts didn't help. The fear didn't go away. The sound of the wind was still in the trees, but now it was joined by something else, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, my eyes darting around the dark clearing, the sound of my heartbeat deafening in my ears. As dawn broke, I finally allowed myself to relax. There was nothing out there. The wind was gone, and the world was quiet again. I must have imagined it. The next morning, I packed up my camp and set off on the next leg of the hike. The sun was up, the sky clear. The trail ahead looked the same as the day before, wide and welcoming, surrounded by towering pines. But that feeling lingered. Something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of my neck were still standing up, and every now and then, I'd hear a rustle from the trees or catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. By the time I reached the second campsite, the discomfort had grown. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, more intense. I set up camp quickly, keeping my eyes on the trees around me. But as the evening drew near and the shadows stretched long across the clearing, I noticed something strange. Footprints. They were fresh, the dirt still disturbed where the edges of the prints had started to dry. They were too big to be from an animal, but not quite human either. The prints led into the trees, disappearing into the underbrush. My stomach turned as I stared at them. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to be paranoid, but I couldn't ignore it either. I decided to stay up that night, keeping the fire bright and strong. As the night wore on, the wind picked up again, though not as fiercely as the night before. But there was something else, a sound. It was soft, almost like breathing. It came from just beyond the light of the fire. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and grabbed my flashlight. I pointed it toward the sound, but there was nothing. The wind continued to rustle through the branches, and the darkness beyond the firelight was thick with shadows. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke with a start sometime after midnight. The sound was louder now, the breathing almost close enough to touch. I sat up in my sleeping bag, frozen, straining to hear. The rustling had stopped, but the breathing, it was too close. It was too real. I jumped to my feet and grabbed my pack, my fingers fumbling in panic as I tried to stuff everything back into it. My heart was racing now, and my legs felt weak. I knew I had to leave, but as I turned to leave the camp, the flashlight beam caught something. A figure, standing just beyond the light in the trees. Not a person, but something darker, something that blended with the shadows. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I didn't stop to think. I ran. My legs were trembling beneath me as I pushed through the underbrush, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I scrambled down the trail. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. By the time the sun started to rise, I was exhausted. My legs burned. My heart was still racing, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare. I finally made it back to the main trailhead around noon, my body aching, my mind in a haze. As I walked back to my car, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The woods behind me were still, quiet, and empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, something that wasn't supposed to be. I don't know who or what it was that followed me, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back to Pine Ridge again. I always loved hiking. There was something about the solitude, the fresh air, and the sound of the wind through the trees that made me feel alive in a way that nothing else did. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a short hike, just a couple of days. Nothing special. But that's the thing about the mountains. Sometimes they have a way of turning the ordinary into something dangerous, something you can't predict. It was late October, and the weather was starting to turn cold. I'd planned a trip to a remote part of the Rockies. I had hiked these trails a few times before, so I felt comfortable with the terrain. My backpack was packed with enough supplies to last me the weekend. Food, water, a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, and a flashlight. I had a map, a compass, and even a satellite phone in case of emergency. I wasn't stupid. I knew how to prepare. The sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon when I set off on the trail, and I was looking forward to getting to my destination before it got too dark. The trail was well-marked, wide, and easy to follow at first. The trees around me were a mix of pine and aspens, the latter now showing signs of autumn with their golden leaves. It was beautiful, the kind of serene beauty that made me feel like I had all the time in the world. I was around 2 hours into the hike when I realized that something wasn't quite right. At first, it was just a vague sense of unease. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches above me in a way that sounded different from the usual wind. The deeper I went into the woods, the less the familiar sounds of civilization faded away. The only thing I could hear was the crunch of my boots on the gravel trail and the occasional bird call, though it wasn't the usual songbirds I'd grown accustomed to. No, these were harsher, more distant. A warning, perhaps. I shook it off as just my imagination. I'd hiked alone before, and the woods had never seemed quite this unsettling. But the thought lingered. The trail narrowed after a while, the trees thickening around me, casting longer shadows as the evening wore on. I took out my phone to check the time. 6:30 p.m. It was getting late, but I still had time to make it to the small camp spot I'd planned on. The problem was the trail had started to feel unfamiliar. I glanced at my map and realized with a sinking feeling that I had missed a turn somewhere along the way. I didn't panic at first. I figured I could just backtrack and find the right path. I turned around, retracing my steps, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was going in the wrong direction. I walked for what felt like hours, each step feeling heavier than the last. The trees around me had changed somehow. They seemed denser, more oppressive. The air grew thicker, colder, and the once clear path now appeared to split in several directions. I tried to pull up my map, but the screen flickered and went blank. A wave of frustration hit me, but I forced myself to calm down. I could make it out of this. I wasn't that far from the trailhead, and the stars would be out soon enough. I heard something then, a faint sound. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but it was there again. Something moving in the underbrush, just off the path. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The noise was getting closer, a rustling of leaves, the crack of a branch breaking underfoot. It was too steady, too deliberate to be an animal. My heart began to race. I wanted to believe it was just a hiker like me, maybe someone else lost and trying to find their way. But as the sound grew louder, I realized it wasn't the clumsy movements of another person. It was something else, something darker. I broke into a run, pushing through the brush, my legs burning as I scrambled up a steep incline. I could hear the footsteps now, following me, gaining on me. I didn't dare turn around. I just focused on moving, trying to find a way to get to higher ground. I needed to find shelter, a way to hide. I was no longer thinking rationally. I was just running on instinct. I reached the top of the incline and found a small clearing. I stumbled into it, trying to catch my breath. The footsteps had stopped. For a brief moment, there was silence, but the silence felt wrong. It was the kind of silence that presses against you, that makes you feel like you're not alone, like something is watching you. I tried to steady myself, telling myself that I just needed to think. The night was closing in quickly, and my phone was still useless. Then I heard it, a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A low murmur, almost like a whisper. I froze, my blood running cold. I couldn't make out the words, but it was clear it was coming from just outside the clearing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I took a slow step back, trying to blend into the shadows, my breath shallow. The voice grew louder, more frantic. I didn't know who it was or what they wanted, but I had no intention of finding out. Without thinking, I dropped to the ground, crawling through the underbrush to the other side of the clearing. My legs were shaking, and every sound around me seemed to amplify. I could hear the voice now more distinctly, as if it was getting closer. I finally got to a small rise, where the ground seemed to dip downward. There was a stream running through the valley below, and I decided that it was my best bet to follow it. Water was a good sign of civilization, and I could follow the stream downhill to the nearest road if I was lucky. But as I crawled toward the stream, I heard the sound again. Closer this time. I looked behind me. A figure emerged from the trees, tall, hunched, and draped in dark clothing. I couldn't make out its face, but the way it moved made my stomach twist. It wasn't natural. Its steps were erratic, like it was struggling to move but still somehow getting closer. I didn't think. I just ran. The night had fully descended now, and the moonlight barely pierced the canopy of trees. I stumbled along the stream, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear the figure following, its footsteps growing louder. I kept my focus on the stream, willing myself to stay calm, to stay ahead. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I didn't dare look back. I kept pushing forward, my legs aching, my mind numb with fear. Finally, I heard something else, the distant hum of a road. My pulse quickened. I wasn't far now. I just needed to get to the road. With one final burst of energy, I sprinted out of the trees and onto the gravel road. I looked behind me, no figure, no sounds, just the quiet of the night. I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest ranger station, breathless and shaking. The rangers took one look at me, and without saying a word, led me inside. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. I don't know who or what I encountered that night, but I do know one thing. The mountains can be beautiful, yes, but they are also dangerous. And sometimes, there are things in the wilderness that don't belong. Things that only show themselves when you've wandered too far. The next day, the rangers went out to search the area where I had been. They found nothing, no footprints, no signs of anyone having been out there. They chalked it up to me being disoriented and confused. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. I left the mountains the next morning, never to return. And I haven't looked back since. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle a bit of solitude. Hiking alone wasn't something I was afraid of. In fact, I enjoyed the peace and quiet that came with it. There was something calming about being surrounded by trees and the smell of fresh earth. The way the quiet seemed to swallow up the usual noise of the world. It was like I could finally breathe. I'd been hiking solo for years, and I never once felt uncomfortable. That is, until that day. It was late September, and the weather was perfect for a long hike. The days were still warm, but the nights were getting crisp, making it ideal for layering clothes. I was in my early 30s, fit and used to the challenges of a long trail, so when I decided to take on the Mount Corton Trail, I didn't think much of it. It was a moderately difficult trail, about a 12-mile loop that promised beautiful views and a secluded cabin at the top where hikers could rest. The trailhead was only about an hour from my apartment in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains, so it seemed like a perfect weekend adventure. The first few miles were routine. The trail was well marked, winding through dense patches of forest with a mixture of deciduous trees and evergreens. As I climbed, the air grew cooler, and the sounds of birds and insects became more pronounced. There's something oddly comforting about that. The deeper I got into the woods, the more everything felt like it was still, like time slowed down, and the only thing that mattered was the rhythm of my breath and the steady crunch of dirt beneath my boots. I paused for a break about halfway through, taking in the landscape. The view from the trail was breathtaking, stretching out over rolling hills and valleys, the peaks of distant mountains faintly visible on the horizon. It was so quiet that it almost felt unnatural, the kind of quiet that makes you stop and listen, like you're waiting for something to break it. But nothing did. Only the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the soft hum of nature. After a short rest, I continued on. The next stretch of the trail was less maintained, with roots and rocks jutting up from the ground in places. My pace slowed as I navigated the uneven terrain, but it was nothing I hadn't handled before. I kept my focus on each step, making sure I didn't trip or twist an ankle. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles, and the further I went, the more isolated I felt. The trail was thinner here, winding through narrow passages between dense brush, and the sounds of the world seemed muffled. I remember thinking that it was starting to feel more like a backcountry trail than the typical one. It was about 3 hours into the hike when I began to notice something strange. At first, it was subtle, a feeling of being watched. I dismissed it, chalking it up to my imagination. After all, this was a popular trail and I wasn't alone. There had to be other hikers ahead or behind me, but the sensation kept coming back. The hair on the back of my neck would stand up, and every few minutes, I'd catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing, just trees and shadows. It wasn't a threatening feeling exactly, more like a low hum of discomfort that seemed to linger just at the edge of my awareness. I decided to pick up my pace, hoping the exercise would distract me from it. But it didn't. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the shadows stretched out longer, and the forest started to feel different. The trees seemed more closed in, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. And then I heard it, a noise. It wasn't an animal. It didn't have the casual, natural rhythm of a deer or a bird. It was deliberate, a snap of a twig, followed by a pause. Then another snap, closer this time. My heart skipped a beat. I stood completely still, straining my ears to hear. But all I could hear was the pounding of my own pulse. The air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath, waiting. I glanced behind me, but there was nothing. I was alone, or so I thought. I started moving again, faster this time, trying to shake the growing unease that was tightening in my chest. It was ridiculous. It was just a hiker or a hunter, someone else on the trail. I told myself that, but my feet were moving faster than usual, and the steady rhythm of my breathing was starting to feel more forced. The trail began to narrow, and the forest closed in around me, the trees growing thicker and denser. The feeling of being followed didn't go away. It intensified. I could almost hear footsteps behind me now, keeping pace with mine. But whenever I turned around, there was nothing. No one. Just the trees and the silence. But I knew it was there. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that gnawing instinct that told me I wasn't alone. At this point, my thoughts started to spiral. What if someone was out there, following me? It wasn't just the sounds anymore. It was the way the forest felt. Felt wrong. It wasn't natural, this tension in the air, the way it seemed like the entire woods were holding their breath. I reached a fork in the trail, and for the first time, I hesitated. I knew the cabin wasn't far from here, just a couple more miles up the path, but something told me to stop, to turn back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I turned around, I'd be giving in to whatever it was that was watching me. So I kept going. The minutes dragged on, and with each one, the feeling of being pursued grew more oppressive. The daylight was beginning to fade, and I could hear the wind picking up in the trees, but it didn't make me feel better. It only made the silence between gusts of wind feel more pronounced. I could hear my own footsteps now, echoing in the stillness, and I began to wonder if the sounds I'd heard earlier had been my own. Then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the trail in a soft twilight, I saw something ahead. Movement. It was a shadow, darting between the trees up ahead, too quick for me to make out any details. My heart stopped. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was ahead of me. I froze, my mind racing. I wanted to yell out, but I didn't. What if it wasn't someone I could trust? What if it was something else entirely? My instincts were screaming at me to turn around, to get out of there, but my legs wouldn't move. Then I saw it again. The shadow, closer this time, and it was moving in a way that didn't make sense. Not like a person, but more like something trying to stay hidden. Something trying to avoid being seen. I took a deep breath, my mind finally snapping out of its paralysis. I had to keep moving. I couldn't afford to freeze. So I pushed myself forward, forcing my legs to move, trying to ignore the pounding of my heart in my ears. The sound of footsteps followed me once more, but this time, it wasn't in my imagination. Someone or something was behind me, and that's when I heard it. A voice. Not words, but the unmistakable sound of a voice. Close. Too close. I was running now. Couldn't stop. I didn't know where the path was taking me, but I had to move. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, but I didn't care. The shadow was still behind me. The voice was still there, just out of reach, but I knew it was there. I could feel it. The cabin appeared ahead of me, barely visible in the twilight. The door was ajar, and the light from inside flickered like a beacon. It was my only chance. I burst through the door and slammed it shut behind me, my chest heaving. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my breath in the silence. I leaned against the door, my heart still racing. It was quiet, too quiet, but the sense of being watched hadn't gone away. It had only gotten worse. The sun had barely risen when I set out. It was a clear morning, crisp and cool, with the kind of chill in the air that would soon be chased away by the midday heat. I'd spent the past few months planning this hike, picking a trail that would take me deep into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, away from the crowds, and into isolation. My pack was heavy with camping gear, water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a small tent. I was looking for peace, or maybe just an escape from the stress of life. Either way, I had a full 3 days ahead of me. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. It was early enough that I had the whole place to myself. I had read that this trail wasn't often busy, which is exactly why I chose it. The last thing I wanted was a bunch of other hikers clogging up the path. The first couple of hours were peaceful. A simple walk through dense pine forests that bordered a crystal-clear creek. The only company I had were the occasional birds darting through the trees and the gentle rustle of the leaves overhead. The quiet was almost surreal, like the world had slowed down just for me. But as the sun rose higher in the sky, the air started to feel different. I didn't notice it at first, but after I crossed a small bridge that arced over a fast-flowing stream, I began to feel off. It was subtle at first, a tightness in my chest, a slight unease I couldn't quite place. It didn't make sense. This was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. Still, I pushed the feeling aside and kept moving, eager to get further into the wilderness. The trail started to climb, and I found myself ascending the side of a hill. The trees began to thin out, and the ground became rockier, more uneven. I paused for a moment to catch my breath and took a swig of water from my bottle. As I looked around, I noticed something strange. The usual sounds of wildlife, the birds, the rustling of animals in the underbrush, had faded away. In their place was complete silence. The kind of silence that felt too heavy, like the world was holding its breath. I shook it off, thinking maybe I was just overthinking things. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail, and I knew I was far from the nearest town. I was alone out here, which is exactly what I wanted. But the silence lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. By the time I reached the summit of the hill, I realized that the trail had taken an unexpected turn. Where I had expected a well-maintained path leading deeper into the forest, I now stood at the edge of a vast, open expanse. The landscape stretched out before me, barren rock and scattered shrubs. There was no sign of the trail ahead, no markers or cairns to indicate the way. I pulled out my map and checked it, then checked it again. This didn't make sense. The path I had been following wasn't supposed to lead here. I stood there for a moment trying to make sense of it when I noticed something strange. A faint trail, barely visible, leading off to the right. It wasn't on my map, but it was a trail nonetheless, marked only by footprints in the dirt. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow it. I'd already made it this far, and I figured a little detour wouldn't hurt. The ground grew steeper as I descended, the trail becoming narrower and more treacherous with each step. The air felt colder, and the silence seemed even more oppressive. I tried to ignore the feeling of dread creeping up my spine, but it was becoming harder to shake. It was almost as if I was being watched. The path eventually led me to a small, rocky outcrop. From here, I could see the valley below, bathed in sunlight. It was a beautiful view, but it also felt wrong somehow, too still, too perfect. That's when I saw it. In the distance, half hidden among the rocks, was a figure. It was standing perfectly still, almost blending into the landscape. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things or if it was real. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. It just stood there, as if waiting for something. I wasn't sure what to do. I considered calling out, but the words died in my throat. I wasn't sure if it was a person at all, and the last thing I wanted to do was make a noise and alert whoever or whatever was out there. Instead, I backed away slowly, carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible. The trail turned again, leading me down into a small valley. The rocks here were slick with moisture, and the air felt even colder than before. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. As I continued on, the path started to disappear completely, swallowed up by the thick underbrush and jagged rocks. My anxiety was building now, the oppressive feeling growing stronger with every step. I was far off the map, and I had no idea where the trail had gone. I started to wonder if I should turn back, but something held me there, an insistent pull urging me to keep going. And then, as I rounded a bend, I saw it. An old cabin, half buried in the undergrowth. It looked abandoned, its wooden walls weathered by years of neglect. There were no signs of life, no vehicles or trails leading to it. It was just there, as if it had been waiting for me. I approached cautiously, my pulse quickening. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. I didn't want to go inside, but I felt an inexplicable urge to take a closer look. It was as though something was beckoning me. Inside, The air was stale and thick with dust. There were old, rotting pieces of furniture scattered around, and the floorboards creaked with each step I took. I moved through the small, dark space, my footsteps muffled by the decay. There were no signs of anyone living here, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned to leave, but as I did, something caught my eye. A faint trail of bloodstains on the floor. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The blood was old, dried and dark, but it was unmistakable. It led toward the back of the cabin, where a small door opened into a narrow stairwell leading down into darkness. I don't know why I went down there. Maybe it was the curiosity, or maybe it was the feeling that something wasn't right, something I had to understand. But as I descended into the gloom, I could hear it, the faint sound of breathing, slow, steady, and unmistakable. The room below was small, a tiny stone cellar that smelled of mold and damp. But the thing that stood in the corner, barely visible in the dim light, was enough to stop my heart. It was a person, or what had once been a person. Their skin was pale and drawn tight over bones, their eyes wide and glassy. They didn't move, didn't react. They were sitting against the wall, as though they had been there for years. I backed out of the room, the air thick with the scent of decay. I don't know how I made it back up to the surface, but I did. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with the images of what I had seen. I didn't waste another second. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran, but when I reached the main trail again, I didn't stop until I was back at the trailhead. I didn't look back. I didn't stop to take in the views or consider anything that had just happened. I just ran, and I never went back. It was the kind of hike that should have been nothing more than a simple day out in the woods. It was spring, but the air still had the bite of winter, sharp and crisp. I'd been hiking for years now, alone, but this one felt different from the start. Maybe it was the weight of the silence, the way the trees felt too close, the trail narrower than usual. But I told myself I was just being paranoid. The trail I was on was known for being quiet. The route I took twisted through dense forest, a place where I could lose myself for hours without seeing another soul. I wasn't in a popular park or a marked trail. This was a lesser-known path in the Appalachians, something only locals would know, and I had been here before many times. But today I felt a strange unease. I had started the hike at 8 o'clock in the morning, expecting a few hours of solitude before heading back. The plan was simple: hike to a particular overlook where I could sit, enjoy the view, maybe have a snack, then loop back to my car. The path began on a slight incline, with the earth soft beneath my boots. Leaves crunched as I walked, and the sounds of birds were constant. Caws, chirps, the occasional rustle in the underbrush as a small animal scurried away. But as the trail grew steeper, the sounds began to fade. The higher I climbed, the quieter the world seemed to become, until all I could hear was my own breathing, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, and the wind rustling through the branches above. The trees here were thick, their trunks wide and knotted with age. I had to duck and weave around a few branches that hung low, but I didn't mind. It was part of the charm being so isolated. By the time I reached a small clearing, my body was beginning to feel the strain. The backpack was heavier than usual, but it wasn't anything that concerned me. I took a break, pulling out a water bottle and taking a long drink. I stood in the clearing for a while, listening. There was nothing, not even the usual hum of insects, just the wind and that strange, unsettling silence. The clearing didn't last long. The trail veered again, curving sharply left, heading up toward the ridge that would take me to the overlook. The air seemed thinner here, the trees even denser, their roots knotted and tangled across the trail. There were sections where I had to climb over fallen logs or squeeze through tight spaces, but it wasn't difficult. It was just more work than I remembered. I continued on for another half hour. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows on the ground. It wasn't unpleasant, just disorienting. I was so focused on my steps, the slippery rocks beneath my boots, that I didn't realize how far I'd gone. I checked my phone. No signal. Of course, there rarely was out here. I hadn't expected it, but it still made me pause. I reached a particularly steep section of the path, where the trail seemed to disappear into a tangle of bushes and rocks. I had to use my hands to steady myself, gripping onto a sharp rock as I navigated my way up. The muscles in my legs burned, but I didn't stop. I was close now. Only another 20 minutes and I'd be there. But then something changed. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a faint sound. A shuffle, maybe. I paused, looking around, but saw nothing unusual. It was probably an animal, probably a deer or something. But as I continued on, it came again. This time, I could have sworn it was behind me. A soft, almost imperceptible scrape of something moving across the forest floor. I turned, but nothing. The trail was empty. I stood there for a moment, listening. The air felt heavier now, pressing in around me. I glanced up the trail. Nothing seemed out of place, but the trees ahead felt wrong. I couldn't quite put it into words. It was like they were too still, too silent, even though there should have been life everywhere. My skin prickled. I hesitated for a moment, but I didn't want to waste time. I was so close to the top. Maybe I was just being overly cautious. I shook it off and pressed on, picking up the pace. The rest of the hike to the overlook was uneventful, though my mind was distracted, my thoughts racing. By the time I reached the ridge, I was ready to stop and take in the view. The ridge itself wasn't particularly dramatic, but it offered a wide view of the valley below. I could see the winding path through the trees, the distant outlines of hills rolling into the horizon. The sun had risen higher, casting long shadows, and the view was still beautiful, despite the odd unease gnawing at the back of my mind. I set down my pack and pulled out a snack. Sitting there, looking out over the valley, I tried to calm myself. Maybe I had just been too focused on the quiet, the isolation. This wasn't a bad place. It was peaceful, beautiful, but that feeling, that constant unease wouldn't go away. I stood up again, needing to stretch my legs. It had been a few hours since I started, and I was beginning to feel the weight of the hike. I took a few steps back toward the trail, ready to head down, when I heard it again. A noise. This time it was unmistakable. A rustle, sharp and quick, coming from the trees behind me. I spun around, heart racing. But again, there was nothing, just the trees. The same view I'd been staring at moments ago. I was starting to feel that familiar unease creep up again. Heavier this time. Something wasn't right. I had been alone for hours now, and nothing had happened. But this felt like I wasn't alone anymore. I took a deep breath, trying to shake it off. It was probably a deer or a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. I was just letting my mind run wild. I turned to continue down the trail, but I didn't make it more than a few steps before I heard it again. This time much closer. A distinct snap, like something stepping on a branch. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't just an animal. Someone was following me. For a moment, I just stood there, not sure what to do. The logical part of me told me to keep walking, to keep going. But the fear that gripped my chest told me to move faster. I had to get back to the car. Fast. I broke into a jog, my boots pounding the trail, the leaves and twigs snapping beneath my feet. The trail ahead was steep, but I didn't care. I had to get away. Each step felt heavier, as if the earth itself was pulling me down. But I didn't stop. The trail was downhill now, and I moved faster, my heart thudding in my chest. I kept looking behind me, but there was no sign of anyone. No one was there, but the feeling, the sense of being watched, was undeniable. It wasn't until I reached a clearing that I dared to glance back again. I stopped dead in my tracks. In the clearing, not more than 100 yards away, there was someone standing. A figure, obscured by the shadows of the trees, but tall and broad-shouldered. I couldn't see their face, but I knew one thing for certain. They weren't supposed to be there. I had been alone on this trail for hours, and this person, whoever they were, had appeared out of nowhere. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I turned and sprinted. I wasn't going to stop. I had to get to the car. I had to get out of here. The trail twisted again, the trees thinning out as I neared the end. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they might give out at any moment. But I didn't care. Couldn't stop. Not now. When I finally broke through the last stretch of trees and saw my car parked in the lot, I felt like I could breathe again. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my keys. I didn't stop to look back, didn't slow down. I got in the car, slammed the door, and locked it. I sat there for a long moment, trying to calm myself, my heart still racing. But the fear wouldn't go away. I wasn't sure if I had imagined the figure in the trees, but the fear I felt wasn't something my mind could easily dismiss. I drove off without looking back, my hands gripping the wheel, my eyes scanning the rearview mirror. The next day, I checked the local news, but there was nothing. No missing hikers, no strange reports from the area. It was as if the encounter had never happened. But I knew what I'd felt. I knew what I had seen. And to this day, I can't explain it.